Scripture reading this morning comes from the book of Hosea, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And I called him out of Egypt. I called my son. But the more I called Israel, the further they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burnt incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. But they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. I lifted the yoke from their neck and bent down to feed them. Will they not return to Egypt? And will not Assyria rule over them because they refuse to repent? Swords will flash in their cities, will destroy the bars of their gates, and put an end to their plans. My people are determined to turn from me. Even if they call to the Most High, he will by no means exalt them. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassions are aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One among you, and I will not come in wrath. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So you can follow along with me. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Yeah. How about, but soft, what light through yon window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. You know, and I know that that's kind of cheesy levels of poetry. I know those are cultural things that we all pick up. You know, the things that make up second grade Valentine's Day cards, right? But you know, I'm just riffing on this, and you know, I used to once upon a time consider myself a bit of a poet. I actually spent a fair amount of time writing poetry and doing that kind of stuff, but my struggle is that I'm not very creative. I like words and I like playing with words, but I'm not really creative. And so the only kind of poetry that I could successfully write were sonnets, because they have a very prescribed rhyming scheme and a very prescribed meter, and it was like a puzzle for me to figure out. And so I loved writing poetry, but once I broke out of that rigid structure and form, I really wrote some true garbage. And that's just me being totally honest. You know, but I love poetry. I love reading it, and poetry, I think, has that way to just layer on top of layer on top of layer on top of layer of meaning. So even though the words are simple, the meanings that are dug beneath them can be extremely profound. And after we read them, it leaves us thinking more profoundly than we ever thought we would about such simple concept like a leaf of grass or a road diverging in a wood. You know, and sometimes poetry gets a bad rap because most of us only hear bad poetry in our day-to-day life. You know, roses are red, violets are blue. You know, or the kind of poetry that you would hear at like a coffee shop open house. You know, that's just full of that blah emotion, you know, like an emotional pile of dark and brooding adjectives. And it doesn't actually pull us anywhere or take us anywhere or make us consider anything deeper. And because that's the poetry that we hear in our day-to-day life, we can assume that all poetry is just an outlet for brooding teens and the adults that never left that brooding phase behind. But my personal favorite is Whitman. I got a copy of Leaves of Grass when I was in high school. And that's what helped me discover what real poetry, true poetry, can look like. And there is some great poetry out there. You know, Whitman gives us this. These are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. they are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they are nothing or next to nothing. If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. If they are not just as close as they are distant, they're nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe. Simple words, but when we listen to them and let them sink in, we sense what the poet is trying to lead us to, this sense of profound interconnectedness between all of us. Simple words used powerfully is poetry at its best. And now, we might not recognize it, but one of the great things about the Bible is that solid chunks of it are actually poetry. We have the book of Psalms and the book of Job and Song of Solomon, and those are all great examples, Proverbs. But throughout the Bible, we get these short and unannounced sections where the author suddenly bursts into poetry. And so this morning, our reading from Hosea, that's what that is. It's a moment in Hosea's prophecy to the nation of Israel, where Hosea takes a brief moment to step outside of his voice, to step outside of this prophecy, and to speak a poem from the perspective of God. And it's a love poem. Not a sappy one. It's not a sappy love poem. You know, it's not talking about puppy love. If anything, this is a poem about unrequited love. A love that is given but not returned. It's a poem about the love of an eternal, transcendent being for the world they created and the fickle, hard-hearted, easily bored and led astray people that live on it. That's you and me and all of us here. And if you've ever been on the giving end of unrequited love, you know what that feels like. When you love another person so much it hurts and they don't love you back. It's one of the worst feelings on the planet. Most of us have felt that once or twice before, and we wouldn't wish it on our worst enemies. Yet, because we all too often consider God emotionless, we fail to understand that when we're too distracted to tend to our own spiritual lives, too busy to read our Bible or to volunteer, too fixated on the things that we want or need, and fail to return to God the blessings that He's given us, this is the feeling that God feels. This poem is about God feeling that feeling. He feels the sting of rejection and unreturned love. God is not far from us. He's not far from what we feel. God created us in His own image. We feel because God feels, and we are created by God for feeling. And God is the author of unrequited love from the fall of Genesis to the last moment where we return finally to unity with God. So the poem of God, if we can call the entirety of the Bible that, is a movement of God's love throughout history, trying to wake us up from our slumber and from our apathy and moving us into a loving relationship with God. The Bible shows that God loved us, how God led us gently in the ways that lead to life, and like a parent, tended carefully for us. It also tells the story of how God reacted with righteous punishment when the people of Israel failed to reciprocate God's love. When Sodom and Gomorrah gave themselves over to wickedness, God destroyed them with fire from heaven. When the whole world forgot God, He sent a flood to start over. God is trying via wrath, the wrath of God, destruction and punishment to get our attention and turn us back. Like a parent disciplining a child, God tries wrath. He tries getting upset. He tries to point down to humanity and say you need to change your direction. But it doesn't work. Over and over and over again, God sends wrath to punish us and move us back onto the path, and we just fall away again. And so, in that final line of the poem that we read this morning, we read the words of God, spoken forcefully, resolutely, matter-of-factly. This line reverberates through the whole passage because of how powerful and awesome it sounds. For I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. God will not come in wrath. He is finished with that. The God of love gets no satisfaction from feeling wrath, from treating us like disciplined children. And when discipline doesn't work, God looks into God's own self and acknowledges that what God is doing is not working. That if it was going to work, the flood would have worked. Sodom and Gomorrah would have worked. It should work, because how many times must a child be punished before they learn the right way? But God realizes that there's a flaw in God's approach. God is trying to win man back by acting like a man. Wrath is how we act when we're scorned. When we love someone and they hurt us, our nature is to react with wrath towards them. But God is not us. God says, I am not God. I am not man. I am the Holy One in your midst. God is not us. God will not be defined by wrath, no matter how much it is deserved. God will find a higher path, a path that brings about restoration without wrath. God goes back to the drawing board and humankind and finds that in God's own way, he will convey the full force of his powerful love for humanity. So God thinks, I am the Holy One in their midst. Hey, wait a minute, that gives me an idea. What if instead of punishing them, I actually go and be in their midst? I show them firsthand what my love, my tenderness, kindness, and compassion are. I show them exactly how different I am, and how if they pattern their life after mine, they will have rest and happiness and peace. They'll find meaning and true joy instead of constantly searching for the cheap substitutes that we chase. And then, by sacrificing myself, I can lay the groundwork for a redemptive grace that all might come so I can love them fully without the static that exists in the world. So why is this important? Why do we care about this crazy direction change that God has? Because it lays the groundwork for Jesus Christ. This is a radical direction shift for God in history. All the way back here in Hosea, we have a moment where God takes stock of creation, takes stock of what's working and what isn't working, and determines that God will not be a God of wrath. The pagan gods of the world that surrounded Israel were all gods of wrath. But our God says, I will not be a God of wrath. Instead, I will be a God of unsurpassed love, a love so deep that I'll send my Son as an example of a life lived and to give his life. God incarnate among us, showing us love. And God does it willfully. God feels wrath. God feels pain. God feels the frustration of watching us mess up day after day. But God controls it and channels it into grace. The saying goes, where there's a will, there is a way. But in our case, God's will is where we find the way, the truth, the life that he offers us freely in exchange for following the example of his Son who came and lived among us that we might know love. Through God's will against wrath, God has laid out for us an alternate path. But we still need to walk it. Our struggles that keep us from God are the same as the ones that faced Israel. The path seems too difficult, too boring, too costly to follow Jesus in comparison to the excitement and relative ease of a life of sin. But God is not far from us. Jesus himself says that we will do even greater things than he did. He did not set an unattainable example. If we believe that Jesus was human, that he was like us, then all he represents is the will to choose God in our life. The will to truly choose God in all the aspects of our life. God's will has been completed. He willed grace into an existence by refusing to be defined by wrath. God is not far from us, but God is not man. God is the Holy One in our midst, and God has willed that we be redeemed and defined by love, just as God is. But we must will it. We must will ourselves onto the path of God each minute of each day. We must will it like God willed, like Jesus willed, like the people who walked on this path righteously before us willed it. It's not a superpower. It's not a puzzle to be figured out. It's a force of will in our hearts, in our minds, every minute. Will we walk that path out of this building? Will we control our wrath as God did? We want to be people of faith, but we can start by being people of will. Amen.